Something about the way she sat, so small, so still, made him hesitate. A millionaire CEO saw a little girl sitting alone at a train station. Then he learned the real reason. Grand Central Terminal was crowded on a freezing December evening. Sterling Hawthorne, the CEO of Pinnacle Industries, moved quickly across the marble floor. His polished shoes clicked sharply as he rushed toward his train, his tailored suit standing out among the stream of tired commuters. That's when he noticed her. A young girl, no older than 8, sat quietly near the information booth with her knees pulled close to her chest. A faded pink backpack rested at her side. She wore a thin jacket that offered little warmth against the cold air drifting through the station. Unlike the crowds pushing past, she did not move, did not speak, and did not call out for anyone. Sterling slowed his pace. Something about the way she sat, so small, so still, made him hesitate. His train was leaving soon, his responsibilities pulling him forward, yet his eyes stayed fixed on the child who seemed invisible to everyone else. What would you do if you saw a child sitting alone like this? Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. Tomorrow, we'll share another one you won't want to miss. Your support helps us bring them to life. Now let's begin. Sterling Hawthorne stopped walking. His train departure slipped from his thoughts as his eyes stayed on the little girl sitting by herself. He had seen homeless people before, men and women asking for spare change, sometimes entire families trying to stay warm near the station walls. But this was different. A child sitting completely alone in the middle of one of the busiest stations in the world unsettled him. He took a slow breath and walked closer. She noticed him when his shadow fell across her. Her body stiffened slightly, like she wasn't sure whether to speak or stay silent. Sterling crouched, careful to keep his voice steady. "Hey there," he said gently. "Are you okay?" The girl's eyes flicked upward. They were dark and tired, as though she hadn't slept properly in days. She gave a quick nod but didn't smile. Her small hands tightened around the straps of the worn backpack beside her. Sterling waited a few seconds before asking again. "Are you waiting for someone?" Her lips moved slowly, her voice so soft he had to lean closer to hear. "I'm waiting for my mom. She told me to stay here." Sterling felt the weight of her words. He glanced around the crowded terminal, scanning the endless sea of rushing adults. No one else seemed connected to her. No parent waved from the ticket counter. No older sibling kept watch nearby. "How long have you been waiting?" he asked. She pressed her knees tighter to her chest. "Since Monday." Sterling's chest tightened. Monday. He looked down at his watch. It was Wednesday evening. "You've been here since Monday," he repeated carefully, not wanting to scare her. She nodded. Her gaze shifted to the floor. "She said not to move. She said she'd come back." For a moment Sterling didn't know what to say. His brain tried to process the possibility. Could a mother truly leave her child here alone for days? Was this girl mistaken? Perhaps her mother worked at one of the shops nearby? Yet, the way she sat, the quiet resignation in her small frame, told him she wasn't mistaken. His eyes drifted to the crumpled McDonald's wrapper near her side. She must have found scraps to keep herself from starving. The thought of his own daughter, Lily, curled up in her warm bedroom in Greenwich, struck him sharply. Sterling glanced at the girl again. "What's your name?" "Ophelia," she whispered. "That's a pretty name," he said softly. "I'm Sterling." She nodded but didn't ask him anything in return. It was as though she had no energy left for small talk. "Ophelia, when was the last time you ate?" Sterling asked. Her eyes shifted toward the wrapper. "Yesterday. I found fries. Someone threw them away." Sterling's throat tightened. He had been about to spend $30 on a train ride and likely hundreds more on a dinner out with clients later in the week. Yet here was a child scrounging for leftover fries to survive. He hesitated, knowing his next words mattered. "Ophelia, do you know when your mom is coming back?" She shook her head. "She said it wouldn't be long. She always says that." Sterling studied her face. No tears, no begging. Just a quiet acceptance. That frightened him more than anything. A child shouldn't accept being abandoned. He rubbed his hands together, his mind pulling in two directions. One part of him screamed to call the authorities immediately. This wasn't his problem. He wasn't a social worker or a policeman. Another part of him, the part that had stopped his steps in the first place, told him he couldn't walk away. Sterling tried again. "Do you have a phone number for your mom? Or a place where you live?" Ophelia shook her head quickly. "She doesn't like phones. We move a lot. She says it's safer that way." The words chilled him. Safer. He wondered what life this little girl had endured to believe constant movement meant safety. A group of businessmen brushed past them, one of them giving Sterling a curious glance. To them, it must have looked strange, a well-dressed CEO crouched on the cold station floor speaking to a child who clearly didn't belong there. Sterling ignored the stares. "Ophelia, do you want me to wait with you until your mom comes back?" She looked up for the first time with a hint of interest. "She told me not to talk to strangers." Sterling gave a faint smile. "That's very smart. You're right to be careful. But maybe I could sit nearby. I won't bother you." Her small shoulders relaxed slightly. "Okay." Sterling lowered himself onto the cold stone floor beside her. His suit would wrinkle, his shoes would scuff, but none of that mattered anymore. For the next few minutes, he let the noise of the station wash over them. The announcements, the shuffle of feet, the echo of hurried voices. Through it all, Ophelia stayed silent, clutching her backpack like it was the only thing she could trust. Finally, Sterling spoke again. "Ophelia, can I ask what's inside your bag?" She hesitated, then unzipped it halfway. Inside was a small stuffed rabbit missing one ear, a change of clothes folded tightly, and a coloring book with broken crayons. Not much else. Sterling forced a smile. "That's a very nice rabbit." Her lips curved faintly, the closest thing to a smile he had seen on her yet. "His name is Mr. Buttons." The simple innocence of the name broke his heart. She was still just a child, clinging to the last piece of comfort she had. Silence stretched again. Sterling knew he couldn't sit there forever. His mind raced. What if her mother never returned? What if leaving her here meant something terrible would happen? He couldn't shake the thought of Lily. If his daughter were sitting alone in this station, wouldn't he want someone to stop? But another thought intruded. What if he overstepped? What if her mother came back in an hour, furious that a stranger had interfered? He didn't know their story yet. He studied Ophelia's thin face, her small frame hunched against the wall. He had built his reputation on decisive action, on making quick calls in business when millions of dollars were at stake. Yet here, with a single child's future in front of him, he hesitated. The loudspeaker announced his train's boarding. Track 17. He could stand up, walk away, and leave this problem to someone else. His home, his life, his responsibilities, all waited for him in Greenwich. But still, his feet refused to move. Sterling finally asked, "Ophelia, do you trust me enough to let me help you?" Her eyes searched his face. After a long pause, she whispered, "Maybe." That single word carried more weight than any contract he had ever signed. The evening train had already departed by the time Sterling made his choice. He should have turned toward the platform, continued with his carefully planned schedule, and let someone else handle the matter of the abandoned child. That would have been easier. It would have been cleaner. It would have been convenient. But as he looked at the girl's small frame, her quiet eyes watching the movement of strangers who rushed past without stopping. Convenience no longer seemed acceptable. He bent down, speaking slowly, careful not to overwhelm her. "My name is Sterling. Do you want to come with me?" Ophelia's lips parted slightly, as though she wanted to respond but wasn't sure if she should. The pause between them stretched long, marked only by the clamor of hurried footsteps and muffled station announcements. Finally, almost reluctantly, she nodded. When Sterling extended his hand, she studied it, hesitant, before placing her much smaller hand in his. Her touch was cold, her fingers stiff from days spent in the drafty terminal. That simple gesture, her choosing to hold on, sealed a decision that would alter not just Sterling's evening, but his entire life. The car ride to Greenwich was nearly silent. The driver kept his eyes on the road, unbothered by the unusual passenger. Sterling sat beside Ophelia, unsure of what to say. He tried once or twice to ask about her favorite food, her favorite subject in school, but each question was met with quiet shrugs. She held her pink backpack close to her chest as though it were the only anchor keeping her steady. Sterling leaned back, staring at the passing city lights. His mind churned. What had he just done? He had bypassed the station guards. He hadn't called the police. He hadn't notified child services. In a world filled with rules and regulations, with systems designed to handle such situations, he had ignored them all. Instead, he had chosen to bring a stranger, a child, into his personal world. By the time the car pulled into the driveway of their Greenwich estate, Sterling's chest felt heavy. The home stood tall and immaculate, lit warmly against the cold night. Normally, its presence gave him pride, a reminder of the life he had built through precision and discipline. Tonight, it felt like a question mark. Caroline met them at the door. She had been expecting her husband to return from the city with the usual weariness of a long day. Instead, she saw him step out of the car with a little girl in tow. Her eyes darted from Sterling to Ophelia, confusion etched across her face. "Sterling," she said carefully, her voice low but sharp, "who is this?" Ophelia shifted slightly, retreating half a step behind Sterling's leg. Sterling exhaled, bracing himself. "Her name is Ophelia. She's been alone in the station for days. I couldn't leave her there." Caroline's eyes widened. "You brought her here, without calling anyone? The police? Social services?" "I couldn't just walk away," he answered. His voice was firm but carried an edge of guilt he couldn't hide. Caroline glanced at Ophelia again. At first, shock was the only reaction she could muster. Their home was ordered, stable, and private. This was not part of their plan. But as she looked at the girl's weary face, her trembling shoulders, something within her shifted. The tension in her expression softened. She knelt down, meeting Ophelia's eyes. "Hi, sweetheart," she said gently. "Are you hungry?" Ophelia's eyes flickered, and she gave the smallest nod. Caroline reached out her hand, not forcing, simply offering. After a moment's hesitation, Ophelia allowed herself to be guided inside. That single gesture marked the beginning of something Sterling had not anticipated. Where he wrestled with the weight of his decision, Caroline seemed to slip instinctively into care. She prepared a simple plate of food, set it in front of Ophelia, and sat quietly nearby as the girl ate. No questions, no pressure, just presence. Later that night, after Ophelia had fallen asleep in the guest room, Sterling sat in his study with a glass of whiskey untouched beside him. The house was quiet, but his mind was restless. He replayed the moment at the station again and again. He could still hear the announcement for his train. He could still see the choice before him: keep walking or stop. He had chosen to stop. But had it been the right choice? He knew the risks. Taking in a child without contacting authorities was not only unorthodox, It was potentially dangerous. What if her mother returned? What if there was more to the story than he had been told? His reputation, his career, even his family's safety. He had gambled all of it on a decision made in a moment of instinct. Caroline joined him quietly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She sat across from him, watching him wrestle with thoughts he couldn't voice. "You're not sure you did the right thing," she said softly. Sterling rubbed his temples. "I should have called someone. I know I should have. But the thought of leaving her there, alone again, Caroline, I couldn't do it." Caroline's eyes filled with something Sterling hadn't expected: understanding. "Sometimes the right thing doesn't look like the safe thing," she whispered. "You gave her warmth tonight. That matters." Her words comforted him, but they didn't erase the doubts. He lay awake long after Caroline had gone to bed, staring at the ceiling. Was this the act of a compassionate man, or the reckless move of someone who let emotion cloud his judgment? Down the hall, Ophelia slept soundly for the first time in days, unaware of the storm stirring within the man who had taken her hand. Sterling closed his eyes, knowing one thing for certain: tomorrow would not be simple. Sterling knew he could not keep avoiding the truth. Ophelia was living under his roof, eating at his table, slowly weaving herself into the rhythm of his household. Yet every night, as he passed by the guest room and saw her curled beneath the blankets, one question would not leave his mind. Where was her mother? He had money. He had influence. Most importantly, he had resources. Calling the police felt too blunt, too impersonal. He wanted to control the search, to protect Ophelia from being treated like a case file. So he turned to someone he trusted, a private investigator named Martin Hale. Martin had worked discreetly for Sterling's company in the past, handling background checks and corporate disputes. He was a man who could find answers without leaving a trail. When Sterling met him in the study, Martin listened carefully as Sterling laid out the situation. "There's no record of her mother?" Martin asked. "None that I've found," Sterling admitted. "Her name is Linda. That's all Ophelia could tell me. No address, no phone number, just Linda." Martin nodded slowly. "I'll need time, but I'll find her." The days that followed were filled with a strange tension. Sterling continued with his work, attending meetings and signing contracts, but his mind was elsewhere. Every evening, he returned to see Ophelia adjusting more to the household, Caroline teaching her to set the table, and their youngest son showing her the family dog. Yet beneath the quiet progress, Sterling's anxiety grew. When Martin finally returned with results, Sterling felt both relief and dread. "I found her," Martin said simply, sliding a folder across the desk. Sterling opened it with careful hands. Inside was a photograph of a woman in her late 30s. Her face was tired, her hair unevenly cut, but there was still a softness in her features. The caption beneath confirmed her name: Linda Marlowe. "She was a nurse," Martin explained. "Bright future. Worked in a Manhattan hospital until 5 years ago. That's when things began to fall apart. Prescription drug misuse, followed by alcohol dependency. She lost her license. 2 arrests, nothing violent, mostly possession charges. She's currently in a rehab facility outside the city." Sterling stared at the photograph. He thought of Ophelia, her quiet resilience, her way of clutching that worn pink backpack. This was her mother, a woman broken by battles few had seen. "Does she know her daughter is here?" Sterling asked. "No," Martin replied. "She believes Ophelia is with relatives. I don't think anyone told her the girl had been left to fend for herself." Sterling's throat tightened. For days, Ophelia had survived in a station while her mother struggled in silence. He felt both anger and sorrow, anger at the circumstances, sorrow at the weight Linda must have carried. It took another week before Sterling was ready to visit the facility. Caroline urged him to be cautious, reminding him that Ophelia's stability came first. But Sterling knew the truth could not stay hidden. The rehab center was a quiet, sterile place with white walls and the faint smell of disinfectant. Nurses guided him down a narrow corridor until he reached a modest room. Inside, Linda sat by the window, staring out at the winter trees. When she turned, her eyes widened. She hadn't expected visitors, least of all a stranger in a tailored coat. "Linda Marlowe?" Sterling asked gently. She nodded, wary. "Who are you?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "My name is Sterling Hawthorne." He stopped, realizing how strange it would sound. "I've been caring for your daughter." Linda's lips parted, and her voice trembled. "Ophelia. You've seen her?" She's okay." Sterling nodded. "She's safe. She's been staying with my family." Linda's composure broke. Tears filled her eyes as she pressed a hand to her mouth. "Thank God," she whispered. "I was so afraid she'd be lost forever." The conversation that followed was raw, stripped of pretense. Linda confessed her guilt, the nights she couldn't stay sober, the days she drifted in and out of reality, the crushing shame of watching her daughter suffer because of her failures. "I tried to be strong," she said, her voice breaking. "But the pain, it was bigger than me. I wanted to keep her close, but I couldn't. I thought if I let her stay with my sister, she'd be safe. I didn't know she would end up alone. I didn't know." Sterling listened, torn between compassion and judgment. He wanted to ask how a mother could let her child reach that point. But as he watched Linda's hands shake, her body fragile from years of struggle, he realized she was already carrying the heaviest punishment, the knowledge that she had failed the person she loved most. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," she said finally, wiping her eyes. I want to see her again. To tell her I never stopped loving her, even when I was broken, especially then." Sterling left the facility with his mind heavy, his heart conflicted. He had seen the truth. Linda was not heartless, nor careless. She was wounded, trapped in a cycle that had stolen years from her life. That night, as Ophelia colored at the kitchen table, Sterling watched her quietly. How much of her mother's pain did she carry? How much did she understand? He knew the reunion would not be simple. But perhaps in facing it, healing could finally begin, not just for Linda, but for the little girl who had waited so patiently in a train station, hoping someone would notice. For the first time, Sterling felt the full weight of what lay ahead. He had stepped into this story by chance, but now he was bound to it by choice. Ophelia's life in Greenwich grew brick by brick, layer by layer. At first, she was cautious. She ate quietly, spoke softly, and looked around the dinner table as though afraid of breaking some unspoken rule. Caroline noticed the way she hesitated to reach for food, waiting until everyone else had started. She began serving Ophelia's plate first, offering gentle smiles that said, "You belong here too." The house itself became a safe place. Sterling had spared no expense over the years, but he realized that its true value was not in its design, but in the way it could shelter a child who had once known nothing but cold floors and restless nights in a crowded station. Caroline decorated Ophelia's room with soft blankets and books, adding little touches to make it feel hers. A framed picture of Ophelia with Lily, taken during their first family outing to the park, was placed on the nightstand. The little girl stared at it often, as though reminding herself it was real. School was both a challenge and a gift. On her first day, Ophelia sat stiffly at her desk, uncertain of what to say when the teacher asked her to introduce herself. But her classmates didn't see a lonely girl from a station. They saw someone new, someone worth getting to know. Slowly, the walls she had built began to lower. She discovered she loved drawing, and her art teacher praised her steady hand and imagination. In gym class, though clumsy at first, she laughed harder than she had in years when she finally managed to score a point during a game of kickball. Friendships sprouted. Emily, a shy classmate with long braids, became her closest companion. They traded snacks at lunch and whispered during recess. One afternoon, Emily's mother invited Ophelia for a playdate. Caroline drove her there, sitting in the car afterward with tears in her eyes. To most parents, a playdate was ordinary. To Caroline, it was proof that Ophelia was no longer defined by what she had endured. She was moving forward. Sterling, however, carried quiet questions. During late nights in his study, he often stared at the city lights across the water, asking himself whether he had done the right thing. The decision to bypass the system weighed heavily on him. He knew there were laws, procedures, and ways of protecting children through official channels. But as he thought of the girls' laughter now echoing in his home, he couldn't regret stepping in when he did. He told himself he hadn't rescued her, he had simply refused to walk past. Meanwhile, Linda's recovery was its own story of courage. At the rehabilitation facility, progress was measured in inches, not miles. She attended counseling, faced withdrawal symptoms, and wrestled with the deep guilt that gnawed at her every waking hour. She often told her therapist that the image of her daughter waiting at the station haunted her dreams. Sterling visited on weekends when his schedule allowed. He didn't arrive as a judge or savior, but as someone who believed she still had a role to play in her daughter's life. During one visit, Linda sat across from him, her hands trembling as she held a styrofoam cup. "I don't deserve her back," she whispered. "No one's asking you to erase the past," Sterling replied gently. "But you can build a future with her. That's what she needs." Linda lowered her gaze. "Does she call you Dad?" Sterling shook his head. "No. She calls me Sterling. She knows who her mother is. She talks about you." Tears slipped down Linda's cheeks. For the first time in months, she felt a fragile thread of hope. When Linda was strong enough for supervised visits, Sterling and Caroline prepared Ophelia carefully. They told her it was okay to feel nervous, okay to ask questions, and okay to take things slowly. On the day of the first visit, Ophelia walked into the room with hesitant steps. Linda looked different, healthier, and clearer, though still marked by the weight of her past. "Hi, sweetheart," Linda said softly, her voice almost breaking. Ophelia stood still for a long moment. Then she whispered, "Hi, Mom." It wasn't a tearful reunion. It was cautious, fragile, but it was real. Over the next weeks, these visits continued. Sometimes Ophelia left smiling, sometimes quiet, retreating into her thoughts. Each visit reminded her that love could be complicated, but it could also be resilient. Caroline was careful never to step into Linda's place. Instead, she became a steady presence, guiding Ophelia through the confusion of belonging to two worlds. At night, she reminded her, "It's okay to love your mom and us at the same time. You don't have to choose." Ophelia nodded, relief washing over her small face. The seasons turned. Winter gave way to spring, and with it came milestones. Ophelia played her first piano recital, her hands shaking until she spotted Sterling and Caroline in the front row. Linda attended too, seated a few rows back, clapping with tears streaming down her cheeks. For the first time in years, she was there, not as a ghost from the past, but as part of her daughter's present. The hardest moment for Sterling came when he realized how much he had grown to love the child as though she were his own. One evening, after Ophelia had gone to bed, he told Caroline, "Sometimes I worry I'm overstepping. That I've taken too much of her story into my own hands." Caroline placed her hand over his. "You didn't take it, Sterling. You shared it. And that sharing saved her." Their partnership deepened, both as a couple and as caregivers. They didn't see themselves as rescuers, but as supporters walking alongside a child who deserved more than life had given her. By summer, Linda was out of the facility and working part-time at a local clinic. She wasn't perfect, recovery never followed a straight line, but she was stable. Sterling helped her find a small apartment nearby, making sure Ophelia could move easily between households. It wasn't always simple. There were moments of tension, disagreements about routines, bedtimes, or homework. But there was also growth. Both households began to recognize that Ophelia's well-being mattered more than their fears. One afternoon, as Ophelia played soccer in the yard, Linda and Caroline sat together on the porch. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Linda whispered, "Thank you for giving her what I couldn't." Caroline shook her head. "We didn't replace you. We just stood in until you were ready." It was an uneasy peace, but it was peace nonetheless. Sterling's proudest moment came at the end of the school year. Ophelia stood on stage during the award ceremony, her shy smile lighting up the auditorium as she received recognition for kindness and perseverance. The applause was loud, but what mattered most to her was seeing both families cheering for her at once. As Sterling looked across the rows, Caroline beside him, Linda a few seats away, Lily waving wildly, he understood something that had taken him years to learn. Family wasn't about perfection, or neat labels, or even one single home. Family was about choice. It was about showing up, again and again, even when it was hard. Ophelia's journey was far from over. But she was no longer the little girl sitting alone at a train station. She was a child surrounded by people who had chosen to fight for her. Two families, once broken and separate, had found a way to share responsibility, to share love, and to share the hope of a brighter future. For Sterling, the lesson was clear. The wealth he had built in boardrooms and balance sheets mattered less than the wealth he had found in human connection. And for Ophelia, the love she received from both her mother and the Hawthorns became the foundation for a life she could finally trust. Her fragile new family had become her strength. Sterling Hawthorne stood just outside the quiet rehabilitation center in Connecticut, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. Months of careful coordination, visits, and tentative steps had led to this day. Linda was finishing her program. For the first time in years, she would be stepping into the world with clarity, sobriety, and the possibility of reclaiming her life. Sterling watched as the doors opened, and Linda emerged, thinner than he remembered, but with a steadiness in her eyes that had not been there when he first met her. She held no luggage except a small duffel, but the weight she carried seemed less than before. He greeted her gently, offering to take the bag. Linda hesitated but allowed him to. "I don't know where to begin," she admitted softly. Her voice trembled not with weakness but with the vulnerability of someone learning how to speak truth without fear. Sterling didn't rush her. He only assured her that beginnings weren't meant to be perfect, only honest. Over the following weeks, Sterling set about helping Linda reintegrate into a life that had long slipped through her fingers. He called upon his resources quietly, careful not to overwhelm her or make her feel like a charity case. Through his connections, he arranged for her to interview at a small community clinic. Though she had lost her nursing license years earlier due to her struggles, the clinic director recognized her past experience and agreed to let her work as a medical assistant while she completed the steps required to reapply for certification. For Linda, the opportunity felt almost unreal. The sterile, fluorescent-lit halls of the clinic became her new ground for rebuilding. Each day, she arrived early, determined to prove to herself and others that she still had value. She began to rediscover the pride she once felt in helping patients, not as someone broken, but as someone steadily repairing. Sterling didn't just stop at the job. He secured a modest but comfortable apartment for her in Stamford. Unlike the towering glass walls of his own mansion, this place was simple. 2 bedrooms, warm wood floors, a small balcony where she could grow herbs. It was not extravagance but stability, the kind of stability Linda had long believed was beyond her reach. When she opened the door for the first time, she burst into tears, not because of the space itself, but because someone had believed she deserved it. The true test, however, lay not in jobs or apartments, but in the fragile bridge between her and Ophelia. For nearly a year, Ophelia had lived with the Hawthorns, slowly healing from the uncertainty of her past. She had built routines, school in Greenwich, art lessons, and sleepovers with new friends. Caroline had become a source of daily comfort, and Sterling, despite his corporate demeanor, had grown into a figure of steady reassurance. The day of their reunion, Sterling drove Ophelia to Linda's new apartment. The girl sat quietly in the back seat, clutching a drawing she had made of a house with two doors, one labeled Home with Mom, the other Home with Hawthorns. Sterling saw it through the rearview mirror and understood the weight of what she carried: love for two families and fear of losing either. When they arrived, Linda was already waiting outside. She had dressed carefully, wearing a pale blue blouse and simple jeans, her hair neatly tied back. But her hands trembled as she watched the car approach. When Ophelia stepped out, there was a pause, a moment suspended in time where mother and daughter searched each other's faces for the courage to move forward. Ophelia was the first to speak. "Mom," she asked, voice small but steady. Linda crouched down, tears already spilling. "Yes, baby. It's me." The girl dropped the drawing and rushed into her arms. Linda held her tightly, whispering apologies, promises, and prayers all at once. Sterling and Caroline, who had come along, stood back respectfully. This was not their moment to claim. It belonged to the two of them. Still, as the weeks unfolded, the transition was not simple. Ophelia had grown accustomed to the rhythm of life in Greenwich, the structured environment, and the sense of security the Hawthorns had provided. Living with Linda required adjustment. There were nights when the girl cried, missing the comfort of Caroline's lullabies. There were mornings when Linda doubted herself, worried that she could never measure up. Sterling anticipated this and stepped in with quiet guidance. He didn't attempt to replace Linda's role as mother, but instead offered to be a steady presence. He ensured Ophelia could still spend weekends with his family, attend her school in Greenwich, and keep her friendships intact. It became a shared custody of sorts, though never officially written into law. Caroline, initially skeptical, surprised herself by embracing the arrangement. Her bond with Ophelia had grown genuine, not out of duty but out of affection. She learned to release her need to protect exclusively, instead recognizing that love could expand without diminishing. She encouraged Linda, reminding her that no mother needed to be flawless to be enough. Linda, for her part, worked tirelessly, not just at her job but at rebuilding her bond with Ophelia. She made meals from scratch, helped with homework, and listened to every story her daughter brought home. At times, the guilt nearly swallowed her, especially when Ophelia innocently compared life at the Hawthorns' mansion with their modest apartment. Yet Linda refused to let shame dictate her role. She reminded herself daily that consistency mattered more than grandeur. Slowly, trust grew between them. Ophelia began leaving drawings on the refrigerator, stick figures of herself, her mom, Sterling, and Caroline, all holding hands. One evening, she told her mother, "I think I have two families now." Linda's heart clenched at first, but she forced herself to smile. "That just means you have double the love," she replied, and she meant it. Sterling witnessed these moments from the periphery, choosing not to intrude but to remain available. Each time he saw Linda persevere, he felt a quiet sense of pride, not the kind born of business triumphs, but of having invested in something profoundly human. He had not merely intervened in a crisis. He had helped sow the ground for renewal. For Linda, life was still fragile. Recovery was never a straight line, and there were evenings when she sat alone in her apartment, fighting the familiar shadows of self-doubt. But now she had anchors, her daughter's laughter, her growing independence at work, and the knowledge that she was not alone in her journey. For the first time in years, She could envision a future not defined by loss but by possibility. By the end of that first year, a rhythm had formed. Linda worked steadily at the clinic, her supervisors impressed with her dedication. Ophelia thrived in school, her grades improving, her social circle expanding. Sterling continued his visits, never overbearing but always dependable. The strange triangle of relationships, CEO, mother, daughter, had softened into something resembling family, unconventional but real. The transformation was not dramatic, but it was lasting. From a child abandoned in a train station, Ophelia had found her way back to her mother, supported by the unlikely intervention of a man who could have walked past her without a second thought. Linda, once defined by failure, now stood with renewed dignity, a mother present in her child's life. And Sterling, whose life had long been measured by profits and acquisitions, discovered a new definition of success: the quiet impact of compassion lived out, one choice at a time. Years passed, and the fragile new arrangement between the Hawthorns and Linda matured into something far stronger. Ophelia grew up surrounded by two households that, despite their differences, worked together to give her stability. She became a young woman whose resilience reflected both the scars of her past and the strength she drew from those who chose to love her. By the time she entered high school, her teachers recognized something exceptional about her. She wasn't simply bright, though she excelled in every subject. She carried a sense of purpose. While many students drifted between classes and activities, Ophelia approached each opportunity with discipline and a quiet determination that impressed everyone around her. She volunteered at the local children's hospital, tutoring younger patients in math and reading. She joined the debate team, not just to win, but to learn how to express her thoughts with clarity. Her senior year became the turning point. At graduation, under a sky just beginning to glow with early summer warmth, Ophelia walked across the stage as class valedictorian. The audience erupted into applause as she delivered her speech, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She spoke not only about perseverance, but about gratitude. "I stand here today because of the people who refuse to give up on me," she said, her eyes moving across the crowd, landing briefly on her mother, then on Sterling and Caroline. "Family is not only who we are born to, but also those who choose us along the way." Linda wept openly in her seat, holding on to the program as though it were proof of how far they had both come. Sterling, normally a man of restraint, felt his throat tighten. For a man used to boardrooms and power plays, this was a moment that eclipsed them all. Shortly after graduation, the letter came. A heavy envelope bearing the seal of Columbia University. Ophelia opened it, surrounded by both families. When she read the word "accepted," cheers filled the room. Not only was she admitted, but she had been awarded a full scholarship, recognition of her academic record, community service, and leadership. Her decision to pursue nursing surprised no one. The years spent volunteering at hospitals had planted a seed. She wanted to give back, to be present for children who, like her younger self, carried burdens too heavy for their age. While she admired her mother's return to healthcare, Ophelia chose pediatrics, explaining that helping children heal meant helping families heal as well. The journey through college was not easy. Long nights of studying, clinical rotations, and the weight of seeing young patients in pain sometimes threatened to overwhelm her. Yet she persevered, always remembering the path that had brought her here. She often called her mother late at night, sharing stories from the hospital. Linda listened, proud that her daughter had chosen a life defined by service. Sterling, too, received his share of calls and emails, updates about exams, small victories, and moments of doubt. He always responded with encouragement, reminding her that perseverance was her strongest quality. Years later, after graduation, Ophelia donned her white coat as a pediatric nurse. Her first day on the job at New York Presbyterian was both terrifying and exhilarating. She moved through the halls, steady but humbled by the responsibility of caring for young patients. Parents looked to her for reassurance, and children trusted her warmth. Colleagues admired her empathy as much as her skill. It was during one of those long shifts, as she sat briefly in the break room, that Ophelia thought back to the little girl who once sat alone at Grand Central Station with nothing but a pink backpack. The thought struck her with force. She had come full circle. From abandoned child to caregiver, from uncertainty to purpose. For Sterling, watching her growth brought a clarity he had not expected in the later years of his career. He remained CEO of Pinnacle Industries, his name still respected in the financial world, but something inside him had shifted. Business victories, once his measure of self-worth, no longer carried the same weight. Quarterly reports, acquisitions, and boardroom triumphs seemed fleeting when compared to the lasting transformation of a life he had touched. He often reflected on the moment that started it all, that December evening when he stopped in the middle of Grand Central Terminal. He could have walked past. He could have chosen convenience. But instead, he chose compassion. That choice had changed not just Ophelia's life, but his own. In quiet moments at home, Sterling would admit to Caroline that his greatest achievement was not Pinnacle Industries, not his investments, not the legacy of his company. It was this: having played a part in shaping the future of a girl who deserved a chance. "I've built skyscrapers," he once said, "but none of them matter as much as watching her stand tall on her own." Linda, too, shared this sense of awe. She often thanked Sterling, though he always brushed it aside, insisting that it was her resilience and Ophelia's determination that carried them forward. But Linda knew better. Without his intervention, without his decision to see her daughter as more than a stranger in need, their story might have ended very differently. As Ophelia's career blossomed, she never allowed distance to weaken her ties. Holidays were still shared between both families. Sunday dinners alternated, sometimes at Linda's apartment, sometimes at the Hawthorns' grand home in Greenwich. The bonds had become unshakable. They were no longer defined by circumstance, but by choice. One summer evening, years after Ophelia had settled into her role at the hospital, Sterling attended a small celebration in her honor. She had been recognized by her department for outstanding service and compassion. Standing quietly in the back of the crowded room, he listened as her colleagues described her impact. The children who smiled because of her patience, the families who found strength in her words. When Ophelia spotted him in the crowd, she excused herself from a conversation and walked directly over. "You know," she told him, her voice steady but full of warmth, "everything I am now traces back to that night. You gave me a chance when no one else saw me." Sterling shook his head. "No, Ophelia. You gave me a chance. You reminded me of what really matters." The moment carried no need for further explanation. It was the truth, shared between them, a truth that defined both of their lives. Sterling Hawthorne spent decades building an empire. His name was stamped on office towers, financial reports, and industry magazines. To most people, he was the picture of success. A man who had conquered the business world through precision, intelligence, and relentless drive. But as the years went by, he realized that none of it defined him as much as one choice he had made outside of business. When he looked back on his life, the numbers on spreadsheets seemed hollow. The applause at board meetings, the endless handshakes at conferences, all of it faded into the background. What remained vivid was the memory of a cold December night, and a little girl with a pink backpack sitting alone in the middle of Grand Central Terminal. That moment became the hinge on which his life turned. By choosing compassion over convenience, he discovered a truth he could never have learned in any office or boardroom. True wealth is not about how much you can accumulate, but how much you are willing to give away. Ophelia had entered his life as a stranger, but she had become his teacher. Through her, he understood that success was not measured by what you owned, but by the impact you had on others. She taught him that generosity creates a legacy stronger than profit margins, and that love carries a weight far greater than any financial portfolio. For Sterling, the lesson unfolded slowly. At first, It was the simple satisfaction of knowing she was safe. Later, it was watching her grow into a confident young woman who would never again feel abandoned. Finally, it was realizing that every smile, every milestone, every victory in her life carried within it the proof of what compassion can achieve. He often thought about how different things might have been if he had walked past her that night. He could have stepped onto his train, returned to his home, and never seen her again. His life would have continued in its usual rhythm, filled with deals and deadlines. Yet he knew, deep down, that it would have been a smaller life. Comfortable, yes, but empty in ways that no amount of money could disguise. The girl who once waited at Grand Central had given him more than gratitude. She had given him perspective. She had given him a story of redemption, not only for her mother but for himself, a reminder that even those at the top need saving, not from poverty or failure, but from forgetting what really matters. Sterling often shared this lesson quietly, not in speeches or interviews, but in conversations with those closest to him. When younger executives asked him for advice, he no longer spoke about aggressive strategies or clever investments. Instead, he told them to look for moments when they could make a difference in someone's life. Business comes and goes, he would say, but compassion lasts. Linda, too, carried the same wisdom. She knew better than anyone that money could not heal a broken spirit. What healed her was the steady faith that people had not given up on her. What healed her daughter was the chance to be seen and loved without conditions. Together, they embodied the truth that Sterling had come to live by. The greatest legacy is not in what you build, but in who you lift. For Ophelia, that lesson became her compass. Every time she walked into a hospital room to comfort a child, she was carrying forward the compassion shown to her. Every family she supported through fear and pain was a reminder of the family that once supported her. Sterling knew his empire would one day pass into other hands. But he also knew that his real contribution to the world could never be bought or sold. It lived on in Ophelia, in Linda, and in the countless lives they touched. The girl who waited at Grand Central had given a millionaire CEO the greatest education of his life. She had shown him that wealth is fleeting, but love endures. And with that lesson, Sterling finally understood what it meant to live a life of true value. Now we turn the question over to you. When Sterling Hawthorne stopped that night in Grand Central Terminal, he had a choice. He could have walked past a lonely child and gone on with his comfortable life, or he could have stopped, listened, and acted. His decision changed not just Ophelia's story, but his own. What about you? If you were in Sterling's position that night, what would you have done? Would you have stepped forward or kept moving? We would love to hear your thoughts, so share them in the comments below. Also, let us know where you're watching from. One of the most powerful parts of these stories is seeing how people from different cities, countries, and cultures come together around one message: compassion matters. If this story moved you, make sure you hit that subscribe button and join us. Your support allows us to bring you more stories that remind us of the best parts of humanity, stories of kindness, resilience, and hope. And tomorrow, we'll be sharing another powerful story that you won't want to miss. Every time you like, comment, or subscribe, you help us reach more people with these messages. It may feel like a small action, but just as Sterling's choice made a lasting difference, your support helps keep these stories alive. So, stay connected, stay inspired, and stay part of this community. Thank you for being here with us, and thank you for helping us bring more stories like this to life.